In 1624, the Dutch Republic founded a new colony called New Nederland and as its capital a year later, New Amsterdam, which of course is the forerunner to today's New York City. Now today the metropolitan area alone has around 8.5 million people living there, and it's one of the most linguistically diverse cities on earth, with between 700 and 800 languages being spoken in the city of New York in its entirety. A lot of them are concentrated in Queens, as can be seen on this map. But did you know that even though it's hardly even in the top 10 today, the first language of New York or New Amsterdam was none other than Dutch? And it may surprise you to know that Dutch was actually still spoken in New York continuously for a very long time indeed. But when did the main language switch from being Dutch to being English? Well, let's find out in today's video. It makes sense that as a Dutch colony or a colony of the Dutch West India Company, the main language spoken in New Amsterdam was Dutch. And that would remain the case, the official language, until 1664, when there were around 9,000 people living there, even though there was a considerable minority that did not speak Dutch as a first language. It was the lingua franca that people used in the colony to communicate with one another and the official language of the rulers there. That was of course until 1664, when the English sailed into the harbour and captured the city, renaming it from New Amsterdam to the name of the king's brother at the time, which was the Duke of York, therefore becoming New York. However, just because it had become an English colony rather than a Dutch one, the vast majority of people that lived there didn't speak English but spoke Dutch with one another. And so the Dutch language would remain for the time being in New York. People even passed it on to future generations. And so there was, for the largest part, even towards the end of the 17th century, after it had been English for several decades, there were still many people that spoke Dutch rather than English. After New Netherland had been annexed to the English colony New England in 1664, hardly any Dutch settlers came to the American East Coast. Many Englishmen came to the region, both from other areas of America and from England, and from other countries too. People settled in and around New York. The Dutch segment in this city, where the Dutch used to form the majority, decreased to about 50% in 1703. That's from the very recommendable source, The Dutch Language in North America by Nicolien van der Sijs. And so we can see that the Dutch proportion of speakers in the city fell quite quickly, so that by 1699 we read from an Englishman writing about New York that despite all of these newcomers, the English nation for above 30 years had possessed of these countries. This seemed rather like a conquered foreign province held by the terror of a garrison than an English colony possessed and settled by people of our own nation. So still New York kept this very distinct flavour from other English and later British colonies on the American East Coast during this period. And of course, as well as the city of New York City itself, there were also settlers that were living outside along the Hudson River and into the Mohawk Valley. In this area, many Dutchmen had settled, and indeed people that didn't originally speak Dutch, including many of the tribes in the area, had also learned Dutch in order to communicate with these people. Now, even as England became Great Britain and time moved on to 1730, we still know that there was a significant Dutch-speaking minority in the city of New York, as it was only in 1731 that Dutch was removed as the official language in court cases, given that so many people spoke Dutch and didn't yet speak English in the city. But it's during the 18th century that we start to see English authorities or British authorities clamping down on the language. In 1758, for instance, Dutch was removed as a co-official language in education. And in fact, from this point onwards, children who spoke Dutch in school would be punished. We can then start to see a shift. Whereas the earlier settlers had spoken other languages, but Dutch had been the main language, we then see a period following British rule when people spoke Dutch at home and English out in the street, growing up bilingual. And it's at some point in the 18th century, the second half, that many of those remaining people from original Dutch families started to more and more speak English and not to give on the language to their children. The question then is, well, when did the last Dutch speaker in New York live? How long did it continue on? Well, there's a few pointers for when this actually started to happen. In 1749, for instance, we get a very interesting description written by a Swede who travelled through much of the northeastern Americas called Peter Kalm. The inhabitants of Albany and its environs are almost all Dutchmen. They speak Dutch, have Dutch preachers, and divine service is performed in that language. Their manners are likewise quite Dutch. Their dress is, however, like that of the English. This is interesting because Albany, or as it was known to the Dutch, Beverwijk, is another city close to New York. So at this time it was still majority Dutch and very Dutch in character, even though New York City, as we saw, was starting to transition at this time. The area of Albany, as it is today, was founded around another fort along the Hudson River called Fort Orange, just as New Amsterdam had been founded around Fort Amsterdam. Even by the time of the American Revolution in 1776, we know that there were still Dutch speakers living in New York City, and in fact Dutch speakers in the wider New York area played a role in that revolution, largely coming out in support of the American revolutionaries against the British, partially also because many still remembered, even though it was around a century before that the area had been captured by the English, they still held certain antipathy towards them because before they had been able to rule themselves. Many Dutch speakers joined in the American Revolution and fought in various skirmishes and battles in the area, and George Washington himself referred to an area outside of New York City as the Dutch Belt, referring to the speakers of the Dutch language that were still living there. How about New York City itself? Well, one estimate places the number of Dutch speakers in the city at the time of the revolution at about a third, which is a significant number considering the amount of emigration that had come in the form of mainly English speakers from both other places outside of New York in the Americas, and indeed from England and Scotland and Ireland itself. Now in 1778, the Declaration of Independence was even translated into Dutch. Possibly this is because of early recognition from the Dutch Republic, or possibly it is because of all these Dutch speakers that were living in upstate New York. And of course, the Americans were successful in their effort to dodge taxes. And so when the US became an independent country, this had a certain impact on the remaining Dutch speakers in New York. There was, of course, that old antipathy against the British, but now that there was a new nation, there was a new hope for people of various disparate origins to become Americans rather than remain subjugated under the British, as many saw it. And this was an impetus for quite a few of the Dutch speakers that remained in New York City not to pass on their language to following generations, but instead to become American. And one way to do that was to adopt wholeheartedly the English language as the language that they communicated in. And so it's around this time, 1800 seems to mark a watershed, that many stopped passing on their language to their children. Part of this may also have been a pressure to conform, as we read from an advert placed in a newspaper in 1807, calling for 10 to 15 turnpikers, yet no Dutchman need apply unless he is pretty well Yankified. Now this is interesting, of course, because the word Yankee itself actually comes from the name Jan Kees, which is a Dutch name. So it's referring to people of Dutch origin in the New York area, at least initially, whereas its usage today, and clearly as it's being used here in 1807, is for an American rather than for a Dutchman. One interesting factor in why the Dutch language continues, because remember in 1664 already it had been taken over by the English, and the English had tried to wipe out the Dutch language there, and now we are addressing things in 1807 that are still referring to Dutch speakers, so that's around 150 years later. One interesting thing to consider is the role of the church in maintaining the Dutch language in New York City and its environs. Now this started to change, for example, in 1763, where we get some of the liturgy being translated into English for the first time in prayer books and other such. And in 1794, Dutch was no longer upheld as the official language of the Reformed Church, the branch of the church that most of the original colonists from the Netherlands had adhered to. That said, Dutch still remained culturally important for these people, as in 1819, when they renamed their church, they kept the word Dutch in the title of the Reformed Protestant Dutch Church in North America. The fact that the Dutch language and the church remained so closely linked together for more than a century supported the preservation of Dutch in the US for a long time. Dutchmen who switched to English still had to learn Dutch to be able to follow the church services, if they remained members of the Dutch church, which is what most of them did. But everywhere, Dutch was pressured by English, even in the church. Still, things looked good at first for Low Dutch. One could even discern ground gained and new speakers. So this is again from the Dutch language in America and says something about the role of the church, given that services and many of the prayer books and the liturgy were all in Dutch. It was an incredibly important language to know for people, even after they had become bilingual with English. This helped to maintain it. However, as the early decades of the 19th century wore on, we can really start to see a change. Obviously, New York kept growing and growing and growing, with people from outside coming in larger and larger numbers, which put pressure on the remaining Dutch-speaking population. In 1826, we still hear about Dutch speakers in New York from a visiting Dutch preacher who had been active in the Caribbean called Gerardus Balthazar Bos. He writes a whole account of his travels, again similarly to Peter Kalm, who had travelled earlier, the Swede. He mentions that Albany was still very much Dutch in character and language, but he also gives us some very important information on the situation in New York City itself, where he says, "When in New York, I expressed my wonder at the general presence of the Dutch language. People recommended that I should wander through the market, which in this city is exceptional, and indeed, I several times heard the language of our fatherland, i.e. Dutch. They were country folk of the north, i.e. the Hudson River, who speak the same. It is said that before the passing of this century, the Dutch language will also no longer be spoken here." So this is interesting. One, because it mentions that Dutch is still, in fact, being heard in New York at the market. But secondly, that these aren't people who live in the city, but are rather the farmers who are coming into the market to sell their wares, who are in neighboring rural areas. And this is a general trend that we see, that in rural areas outside of New York City, Dutch continued to be spoken for longer than in the city itself. So I guess this is Dutch being spoken in New York City, but not direct evidence that the inhabitants speak it. And following this, the references to Dutch speakers become a bit harder to find. One is quite interesting. It's from a newspaper in 1858, mentions that in Queens, quite a lot of the Afro-American population that were living there were Dutch speakers. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find the original source. Much of the inspiration for this video came from reading a very interesting book, which is only available in Dutch, called De Taal, hoe de Nederlandse taal bijna Amerika veroverde. It's a very interesting book, but unfortunately it's not been translated into English, but it's essentially about the Dutch language in North America, and he makes reference to this there. This is something that I will dive into in another video, because there's actually quite a few interesting things here, where many formerly enslaved people and some freed people of African origin and mixed origin switched to speaking Dutch already very early on and continued to speak Dutch. And there are some very interesting Dutchisms in African American English in the New York and New Jersey area, but that is for another video. Now, one of the last references to Dutch being spoken in New York City itself is from 1866, when the wife of the Dutch consul in the city mentioned that it is a fact that 1 out of 10 people in the city will be able to understand you, although it is not our civilized Dutch that they speak. Of course, it's very difficult to actually verify this. I mean, it's not like she went out and gave out a survey to everyone and found that exactly 10% could understand Dutch. But clearly, she was meeting some people in the city who understood Dutch. And the fact that she mentions that it's not the civilized Dutch being spoken suggests that these are people who have not just arrived off the boat from the Netherlands, as there was also a fair amount of emigration from the Netherlands into the US at this time, but rather that it is the variant of Dutch that was spoken in North America that actually had almost started to become its own language at this point. That's again something I'd like to cover in another video, is how this Dutch language evolved in America. It almost became a kind of Afrikaans, but then with different influences. But this does suggest that there was still a knowledge of the language in 1866, which is pretty incredible given that we're now 200 years after the English takeover of New York. So the final reference to the Dutch language that I've been able to find being spoken by, let's say, a native in New York City is in 1896. But again, this is simply referenced in the book. I looked through the entire newspaper in which it should have been, and to no avail, I wasn't able to find it. But anyway, that is the last reference that I was able to find in the city itself from the original Dutch colonists who set up shop there in 1624. However, as I mentioned already in the video, outside of the city, the Dutch language continued. But for how long exactly? Well, that's something for another video. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching. As I mentioned, I've got a couple more videos on these topics coming on. If you'd like to find out more, if you'd like to share something, then hit me up in the comments. I really appreciate it, and a huge thank you to the patrons for making it possible to make these videos. Apologies, it's been a bit of a pause in videos. It's been a very busy time, but there'll be some interesting stuff coming soon. So thank you very much for watching. I'm Hilbert, and this is The History.